Okay, in this PowerPoint presentation, we're going to take a look at the United States during the Cold War of the President Truman and President Eisenhower era. Let's look at a couple of things, first of all, with regards to domestic affairs, in other words, here in the United States. As far as the economy was concerned, the gross national product kind of slumped and prices slightly increased. And a lot of this was due to the removal of wartime price controls. And this kind of had an effect on people and kind of scared them a little bit. You also are going to see a large number of strikes. You're going to see labor trying to get its fair share as a result of some of these price increases. And this will anger conservatives in Congress. And they're going to strike back with a new law called the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, passed mostly by conservative Republicans. And what it did is outlawed closed or all union shops. As a result, it'll slow the overall growth of organized labor. So labor gets kind of pushed back a little bit. It also required labor leaders to take a non-communist oath. As you recall, this is kind of an era of Red Scare, and this kind of played a role in that too. We mentioned this last chapter, chapter 25, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, or the GI Bill. And again, it allowed veterans to attend college, guaranteed loans for homes, farms, and small businesses. Interestingly, one of the effects of it was a raised education level in the United States and also stimulated some massive construction around the country, all giving a tremendous boost to the economy. In 1948, you're going to see a start of a 20-year economic boom in this country. And you're going to see in the United States alone, 6% of the world population, that's all we were, and yet we're going to carry about 40% of the entire planet's wealth. That's an economic boom. The Veterans Association is going to help these veterans by guaranteeing loans that are very easy for them to be able to pay back. You're going to see the size of the middle class grow extensively, about 60% of American people by the mid-50s. That's huge. That plays a major, major role in the economy of the United States and also its tax base. Women reaped amazing rewards during this time. We kind of mentioned this last time. They saw a whole host of new jobs that were available to them. You also saw the service industry kind of outgrow industry. So service industry is things like McDonald's is a service industry, but there are a lot of others too. This also becomes kind of for women anyway, they saw this little clash between motherhood and employment. A lot of women left the workplace after the war and went home again. And a lot of feminist movement starts here that kind of criticizes these ladies for doing that. And the revolt really plays out in the 1960s. But always keep in mind too, the large part of our economic success was really due to the military budget. There was also tremendously cheap energy. Oil didn't cost that much. We just saw a period in our history here a couple of weeks back where it was under $1. That made driving around kind of nice, except you couldn't go anywhere. And also the accessibility of education. Education was now kind of mandated that everybody up to age 18 had to stay in school. And again, productivity is really the key to prosperity. The more you can produce, the more prosperous you become. And farmers, even though they only made up 2% of America's population by 1990, they literally fed most of the world. I don't think Jefferson, who wanted to make America that agrarian society, I don't think if he would looked at, he would see this stat right now. You also will see a large rise of what's called the Sun Belt. From Virginia, it's kind of sometimes referred to as that smiling crescent. From Virginia, Florida, Texas, Arizona, all the way to California. This was a massive shift in population, mostly because of of the war, mostly because of wartime war industry jobs. And some people just wanted warmer climate, and there were roads now that made it a little easier to move out there. And so you saw this shift in population. And that shift in population also creates kind of a change in wealth and in government. Um, a lot of this growth happens as a result of the electronics business and aerospace industries that take place in these areas. You also see this mass production of identical houses with the creation of suburbs. The fact that they're mass produced meant they were cheap. And of course, the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, and the Veterans Administration all supplied these home loans that made it very attractive to own homes. Unfortunately, um, this has a real interesting effect, social effect, because who had money and could get loans? That was whites. As a result, whites headed to the suburbs, and blacks, of course, who have moved in from the South looking for jobs and industries, kind of move into those inner city neighborhoods. All right, the baby boom. This really is a amazing phenomena. You're talking about an additional 50 million babies in 15 years. You take a look at the chart on the bottom right. Keep in mind, this boom takes place after a lot of men head home, and they either get married or they meet their wives again after a few years at war, and boom, we've got a lot of babies. All right. If you know that anything now with this, you realize that the baby boom generation has moved into the retirement years. And so, just to give you an idea, I'm at the very end of the baby boom generation. All right. I'm at the very end. Think about the economic impact, though, as these children grow from babies and on up. Think of the people that made a lot of money here with a little entrepreneurial spirit, thinking we have all these babies, let's make them some food. Gerber. These babies all need toys. Fisher Price. These babies all need clothes. Well, that industry grew big time as well. In the 1960s, $20 billion in clothes and rock music. Clothes primarily were probably Levi blue jeans. Let's move on to Truman during this time period too. Truman had promised a fair deal for everybody. You know, you had the New Deal with Roosevelt, FDR. Now you got Truman's Fair Deal, which was full employment, improved housing for the poor, higher minimum wage, better farm price support, new TVAs, Tennessee Valley Authorities, and an extension of Social Security. You see the asterisks by some of these. Those are the only ones he actually had an impact with. What about Harry Truman? First of all, understand he was an accidental president that takes place after FDR died in April of 45. He's also the guy who was responsible for giving the order to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Harry Truman, a lot of, when you talk about Harry Truman, a lot of people, especially congressmen, didn't necessarily have a lot of respect for Harry Truman, but they kind of describe him as a tough little guy who was big on the big things but small on the small things. He was known for taking on the responsibility that he walked into as president, and his slogan, and this was on his desk, the buck stops here. Keep in mind, Harry Truman is also the last president we will have that does not have a college education. Let's take a look at some foreign affairs in this. We talked about this a little bit last time, the Yalta Conference. This was a meeting of the big three. They're listed there left to right: Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. And they met to kind of talk about what to do with a post-war Europe. This is also where they agreed to start the United Nations, and of course that was FDR's plan. And he really had to side a little bit with Stalin because he wanted Stalin to be a part of this. in this Yalta conference, they will talk about what to do with Germany. But you also, something that gets kind of forgotten here is that Stalin agrees to provide free elections in Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. But once the war was over, keep in mind who didn't leave Europe? The Soviet Union. The United States left. We keep a presence there, but that was only to help rebuild and to help protect. Again, sketched general intentions, tested one another's reactions, and overall, most people back in the United States, or politicians anyway, and pundits, really kind of thought Roosevelt gave in too much. What did this mean for the United States and Soviet relations? You had US with capitalism and free enterprise versus the Soviet communist system. A couple of things that played into the Cold War era here is that the US is going to terminate their land lease aid to the Soviet Union. They also deny a reconstruction loan to the Soviets of $6 billion, while they approve $3.7 billion to the British. Part of the denial comes because of what Soviet Union's plan to do with it. So there's more to it than we just didn't like them anymore. Soviets were also mad here. This kind of played a role. We kept them out of the atomic project. They didn't really know about it until just about the very end. And so all kinds of things like this. This is just a fateful progression of events, misperceptions, as well as genuine conflict of interest, which will provoke the two nations in a very intense standoff over the next probably 20, 30 years. One of the things that kind of takes place, and again, this gets major support from FDR's idea of an open world, to try to piece the world together after the war, is the Internal Monetary Fund, the IMF. And these things still all exist here. They encourage world trade by regulating currency exchange rates, making it easier for places to trade all around the world. They also create a World Bank to try to promote economic growth. Of course, most of the money that went into it came from us. The Soviets refused to participate because they thought they would have to try to be more capitalistic versus communistic. And of course, FDR's big plan was the United Nations. The United Nations kind of is created in kind of, you might say, two houses, an upper house and a lower house. Upper house would be the Security Council, or the Big Five: US, Britain, USSR, which is Russia now, France, China. Each had the right to a veto. And if one person vetoed over something, it killed it for everything else, which plays a huge role when all of a sudden there's conflict in Korea. And then there's the General Assembly. All the countries of the world get to meet there. This, of course, the United Nations building is in New York City. If you ever have a chance to get to New York, this would be a great place to take a tour. It's really pretty cool. A number of agencies are created out of that. UNESCO and education, FAO, I believe, is agriculture, and WHO is the World Health Organization, which we're hearing a lot about with COVID-19 right now. Also, one of the big things that happens almost right away was the idea of outlawing nuclear weapons, but they did nothing. This was the Baruch plan, was to try to leave the plans of nuclear weapons into the vault of the United Nations, putting probably the Security Council in charge of sealing that and never letting anybody see it. The US wanted a new agency to really control it. The Soviets wanted it outlawed. And their reason for saying outlawed was so that the United States would give up the plans, or burn them, you might say, and the USSR would continue to make plans to build one and then perhaps use it. So it ended up, nothing happened. They really blew kind of a neat opportunity there. All right, we mentioned that they would talk about Germany at the Yalta. They will punish Nazi leaders for war crimes in the Nuremberg trials. They divide Germany into 4 zones. I wish I would have had a better map here. Sorry about that, everybody. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union all occupy zones. I can tell you that the green is the Soviet Union. I think the pink or mauve there is the United States. That red dot in the middle of the green there, that is the city of Berlin. And in Berlin, everybody had a quadrant. The Soviets, the United States, Britain, and France. Soviets wanted German reparations. They wanted to pay for the war. Western allies actually opposed that, figuring that the only way to reestablish a good economy in the world again is to get Germany producing again. And the Soviets just, they were so opposed to that and eventually started tightening their grip on their zone, making it very difficult for anybody to get in or out of Berlin, that little red dot. As a result, most people are kind of in Berlin are stuck and they're not getting stuff. And so the United States organizes a year-round airlift known as the Berlin Airlift in 1948. Again, it was divided into sectors. The Soviets tried to choke off all access to Berlin, and this is where you kind of get that standoff and finally a wall separating East and West. The West would be capitalist, the East would be communist. Interestingly, the Berlin Airlift really shows America's commitment in Europe, and Europe saw that as a good thing because after World War I, we just kind of packed up and left. This gets interesting here too. One of the things that happens is that the Soviets continually tried to steamroll Soviet communism into all parts of Europe and actually around the world, to the point where our president, Truman, says, I'm tired of babysitting the Soviets. Well, a couple of things happen here. The guy whose picture here, this guy's name is George Kennan. He's actually from Milwaukee, but he's a Soviet Union specialist. He's been living in Moscow for a long time, and he sends what's called the famous now long telegram to Truman in 1946, literally trying to explain to him Soviet Union's insecurity to Western power, that the Soviet Union could literally be stemmed, their advancement could be stemmed by a simple, firm, and vigilant containment. And Truman agrees to this, and this becomes known as the containment doctrine. In other words, you're going to try to stop, you're going to stand up to the Soviets where they are and contain them right where they are so they don't advance any further. One of the standoffs for this is going to be actually in Greece and Turkey, as both countries are about to go defunct and the Soviet Union is about to come to their aid. Truman's going to convince Congress for a $40 million aid package or stimulus package for Greece and Turkey. The reason? If Greece and Turkey go, the Mediterranean gets a standing with the Soviet Union there. And that what meant they would have access not only to the oceans, but also to Middle Eastern oil. Part of the Truman Doctrine was tons of money to support free people's choice to pick governments, especially free enterprise, against our minorities or outside pressures, like the Soviet Union. So lots of money, Truman Doctrine, lots of money to protect against Soviet pressure in Europe. The Marshall Plan. This was probably one of the biggest things to happen and actually rebuild Europe all by itself. George Marshall, remember, he was actually in charge of the military during World War II. He becomes Truman's Secretary of State. It was a joint plan for the United States to help Western Europe and even the Soviet Union to rebuild, but it was somewhat forced cooperation. The Soviets refused it, thinking it would be Marshall Plan. They also refused it, thinking that they would have to be more capitalistic versus communistic. One of the interesting quotes about this is if Uncle Sam didn't get Europe on its feet, they'd never get them off their backs. And so it was a stimulus package to help rebuild. And $12.5 billion over 4 years in 16 countries. It was considered one of the huge successes of the Cold War and post-war Europe. Also, big news, 1948, the United Nations recognizes Israel as a nation. Mostly a humanitarian sympathy, but it helped the Jews get their own country. What complicates this is that the United States is the first country to recognize this. And that'll create problems in the Middle East for the United States to this day. 1947, Congress passes what's called the National Security Act. This creates the Department of Defense, which was the old Department of War, trying to unify all the armed forces. And so in this, you get we now know as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, formed by the heads of each branch of the service, except the, can't think of it, but Coast Guard, I'm sorry. It does, in this National Security Act, it does establish the National Security Council. This is where we got the CIA. CIA was our foreign fact-gathering organization. And the United States will also then join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or what we call today NATO. The Soviet threats to Western Europe was such a threat to Western Europe that the United States realized it had to be there to try to protect. And this became kind of a capitalist versus Soviet Union kind of standoff. Interestingly, one of the things here is an attack on one was an attack on all. And so it kind of, remember, we didn't really want to ever ally to or become an ally or an alliance with those European nations, but here we were kind of forced to do it. And a big threefold purpose: keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. How does the Soviet Union react? They formed their own, you might say, NATO, called the Warsaw Pact. So the Soviet Union and all their satellites. In Asia, Japan's getting rebuilt with the help of MacArthur and lots of money and cooperation. They will renounce militarism, which was old Japan, for democracy. In China, Chiang Kai-shek, or as his name is spelled at the bottom there, he will lose out to Mao. They kind of worked together during World War II as Japan was trying to take over China. Mao wins, and Chiang Kai-shek is forced to Taiwan. And so there becomes a real issue of who does the United States support, China or Taiwan? Well, we had been a strong ally with Chiang Kai-shek, so most of that went there. And eventually in the 1960s and 70s, the United States works on its relationship with Japan. This was considered a huge defeat for America and its allies as they saw China, one of the largest and most populous countries in the world, become communist. And now you're going to see communism kind of steamroll through a lot of other countries here now too. And America will actually go to war to stop communism at the 38th parallel in Korea. This provided proof for the National Security Council in their issue of Order 68, which was the expansion of our military. 18% of the gross national product would eventually go for military expense. I mentioned there was a Red Scare after World War II. States became very security conscious. They had to take loyalty oaths, especially teachers. They didn't want us teaching communism to our students. And they passed a lot of anti-sedition laws. In 1949, 11 communists were tried for overthrowing U.S. governments just in New York City alone. And you also, the Taft-Hartley Act made labor leaders take anti-communist oaths. This all played kind of a role in that. The HUAC is formed. It's the House Against Un-American Acts Commission, gets the nickname HUAC. They were created, that was created to investigate subversion within the country, Committee on Un-American Activities. One of the major trials here would be the Alger Hiss trial. He was considered a communist agent. Richard Nixon was kind of, I believe, the chairman of the Committee of Un-American Activities, goes up against him. This kind of gives a name for Nixon here. And he ends up going to jail for perjury, lying under oath and not being charged as a communist spy. The Rosenbergs were spies. They were both scientists for the Manhattan Project, and they were caught leaking secrets to making the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. And they will be tried, they will be convicted, and they will be executed for espionage. Joe McCartney was known as the socialist witch hunter. He's a senator from Wisconsin. He's a World War II vet. And he goes on a tear saying he's going to find all of these people in the State Department who are communists. He doesn't find a one. It actually becomes kind of a joke. All right. During the Eisenhower era, Eisenhower becomes a president in the election of 1852. And of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower was the head of the military force in Allied commander in World War II in Europe. He goes up against, or he doesn't go up against Nixon. Nixon's actually going to be his vice president. He was known as the relentless red hunter. He almost loses out on this. All of a sudden, a report comes out that he was using campaign money for his own expenses, and he'll go on TV. That picture on the bottom left is actually him in his famous Checkers speech. Checkers, by the way, was the name of a dog that was given to him for his children by a rich oil man in Texas. And he got all the oohs and ahs when Checkers came on TV with him, and people kind of put it aside that Nixon wasn't a bad guy. Ike never really liked Nixon. So Democrats ran the kind of inept Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, also of the Illinois politicians. And Eisenhower, he's like Grant right after the Civil War. He's like the most popular guy in the world. Who wouldn't vote? But the Korean War is going on, and so one of the things that Eisenhower said in his campaign was, "If it's not over, I'm going over there and I'll make sure it ends." Well, he goes over there, doesn't get a whole lot of success until he threatens to use an atomic weapon, and finally an armistice is signed. And 1953, you have the ending of the Korean War. Large costs in American lives. Also in the 1950s, you have the start of the civil rights movement. I'm sure most of you recognize the picture of the young lady that's on that bus right there. But let's take a look at some demographics here with regards to civil rights. 150 million Americans in the 1950s, 15 million African Americans, of which 10 million are still in the South, which means their life is kind of ruled by Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws govern every aspect of Southern life, separating blacks from whites in society, economically, and politically, leaving them politically powerless. 20% of Southern blacks are actually registered to vote. In some areas in the Deep South, as little as 5% registered. That's political powerlessness. December 1955, things begin to change, and Rosa Parks plays a big role in that. She refuses to give up her seat to a white person on the bus, and her arrest is going to lead to a year-long bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. What makes this such a powerful boycott is that the majority of people that rode the bus and relied on the bus were blacks. And when they got no money, the buses finally consented to desegregating their buses. And this really served a notice throughout the South that blacks just aren't going to submit to this kind of indignity anymore. And so the civil rights movement is on. Remember that decision in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson? I'm not sure if you remember that, but that was the Supreme Court case that said you could keep things separate. In other words, you could segregate if things were equal, separate but equal. In the case of Brown versus Board of Education, the NAACP is going to go after the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, on behalf of Mr. Brown. And in 1954, the Supreme Court declared that things were not equal and that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional and it had to change now, not down the road, now. Interestingly, Eisenhower wasn't really behind this or very supportive of this. um, which kind of gives you an idea of how racism was a pretty big thing in the 1950s yet. You would have thought it would have changed a little bit, but it really changing people's minds is taking a long time. So 1957, crisis at Little Rock. The governor of Arkansas, Mr. Orville Faubus, sends National Guard to prevent 9 black students from enrolling in Little Rock Central High School. They were known as the Little Rock Nine. I mentioned in the slide before, Eisenhower wasn't really in favor of this, but he was the president of the United States and a law was a law. And so he sends troops to escort these 9 people into their classes to prevent them. It didn't mean that people didn't still harass them. They still suffered severe persecution for their efforts in trying to go to this school. 1957, Martin Luther King forms the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was a conference that would mobilize black churches on behalf of black rights. Churches were an excellent way in which blacks around the South could get information and organize, and King is very instrumental in putting this little conference all together here. You're going to see a large number of sit-ins, one of the famous ones in February 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. They're known as the Fab Four. They went to a Walgreens diner and sat at the counter, which was, according to Jim Crow laws, a no-no. They sat there. They took amazing persecution. They went back the next day, 19 people went with them. They went back third day, 85 people supported them. And they went back a fourth day, and 1,000 students went with them. This created just a kickoff of wait-ins, lie-ins, pray-ins, and all kinds of ins as a result of these 4 guys. And shortly after that, Martin Luther King's going to help organize an organization known as SNCC to try to get students to kind of pull together in protesting against Jim Crow laws. Eisenhower on the home front. Eisenhower is going to be responsible for our interstate highway that we have in the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. Created tons of jobs. This is almost a New Deal thing from back in the Great Depression. And workers will build 42,000 miles of interstate highway, $27 billion price tag. And as a result of this, this was to transport goods across the country, east, west, north, south. And this is going to be tough on railroad companies. And so the railroad company gets kind of hit all over it. Secretary of State for him, Eisenhower, is a guy by the name of John Foster Dulles. He's a Secretary of State. Dulles Air Force Base is named after him in Washington, D.C. If you go to D.C., you might land at that airport. It's also where the Enola Gay is stationed. They have a huge museum of airplanes and things like that. Even a space shuttle is in there. He creates a little different policy against the Soviets, and it's called a rollback strategy compared to Truman's containment. He wanted to cut military spending to try to balance the budget, and so they had to come up with a different strategy because that meant you wouldn't have a lot of men. And so he creates what's called the Strategic Air Command, or the SAC program. And the SAC program, so you didn't have to have so many men protecting Western Europe. You'll create these super bombers, and a picture of that in the lower right there. And these super bombers were capable of carrying nuclear weapons of mass. This would be called or considered massive retaliation if the communists got out of hand. And he sells it to the country as more bang for the buck. We can drop these bombs instead of putting bodies there. Stalin, by the way, is dead, and the new leader of the Soviet Union is a guy by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. He played a key role, an instrumental role, in defending Stalingrad in the Battle of Stalingrad. So Eisenhower will seek negotiations with him to try to create a more open skies attitude. Akita just rejects him. He tries to take a huge stand against Eisenhower. In 1956, the Hungarian incident really exposes the SAC program as kind of more than what we asked for. Hungarians are going to strike for freedom. They didn't like the fact that they didn't get to choose for themselves, that they could be they could be communist or they could be a capitalist or democratic. The Soviet Union just made that decision for them. And so they struck for freedom, and the Soviet Union hits them hard and just slaughters them. And millions of Hungarians are going to try to run away and just flee. And some will make it, some will not. Many will not. The United States will actually alter immigration laws since we didn't send those super bombers to protect them or help them. We felt guilty and decided we would let them into the country. Why didn't we use the SAC program? Well, we kind of thought that this was maybe a little too heavy for a minor crisis like this. Of course, Hungarians didn't really think that. Vietnam, this is an issue too. And it all starts with nationalism for the Vietnamese and self-determination for them against the French, who the French were kind of their colonial leaders, much like England was to the United States back in colonial America. Well, the leaders of Vietnam didn't really want that. And they wanted France out, and they wanted to kind of, govern themselves. Ho Chi Minh, one of the Vietnamese leaders, tried to reach out to the United Nations, tried to reach out to the United States, didn't get a whole lot of support because, well, you had that NATO thing, and France was a part of that too, and so everybody felt like they had to support France. Interestingly, so did Eisenhower. In 1954, Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese are gonna trap the French in a Vietnamese city that I cannot pronounce, and so I won't try. And eventually what happens is the French will fall to the nationalists, to the Vietnamese, and as a result, they will split Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Ike, by the way, kind of held back. He supported France, but he didn't really help them with everything France wanted, mostly oil. But Ike did promise economic and military aid to Diem, that's his last name, can't pronounce his first couple. The Diem regime was not necessarily very legit. It was kind of somewhat corrupt. But when Vietnam gets split here, the North is kind of communist, the South is more democratic under Diem. But Diem is somewhat corrupt, as is his wife. And it's kind of almost as if Ike is backing kind of a losing horse here. Also, issues in the Middle East arise. In Iran, in 1953, we're going to engineer a coup and put in charge of Iran a guy that will be called the Shah of Iran. In 1979, Iranians kind of take their revenge, and it'll be the Iranian hostage crisis. And that kind of laid out our relationship with Iran to this day. The Suez Canal isn't part of Iran, it's actually part of the Egyptian situation here. And Egypt kind of flirts with Western nations as well as the Soviet Union for money. And when things don't really happen, England and France on their own kind of, they don't want to give up the Suez Canal and aren't really happy with how Egypt is kind of, toying with them. And so they kind of covertly go after Egypt here, and hoping that the United States would also supply them with oil as well and some help. And Ike is kind of like, not going to do it. And what's interesting is that the United Nations comes in for the first time here. This does create another doctrine, and that's the Eisenhower doctrine. And that means tons of money for the Middle East to try to keep communism out. There's also, by 1960, a lot of these countries that you see in the background here these are these oil countries. And prior to this, the United States and England and France, they were pretty much supporting all the infrastructure for oil companies and oil refineries. These countries they form a cartel, and they kind of now call the shots. So that's what OPEC is. The space race. Who can get out into space first? Well, in 1957, the Russians did. In Sputnik 1 and shortly after, Sputnik 2. And the Soviet Union is going to use this as proof that their industrial production was powerful, more powerful than the United States. And that communist way of doing it was definitely better than the capitalist way of doing it. Kind of a slam at the United States. Back in the United States, you had this fear that if they could blast something up there, they could definitely blast something over here. And as a result, Eisenhower kind of tries to calm the country down, saying, don't worry, that's not going to happen. And so he starts the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. And then also the National Defense and Education Act in '58, which is going to give tons of money to science and math. And so if you're wondering why you got so much science and math in school, right there, everybody. Billions of dollars for missile advancement to NASA. And the education system got criticized for just being too old-fashioned, maybe. And in 1958, you see one of our little nuclear retaliations here as we, one of our first nuclear subs, the USS Nautilus. And there it is, breaking through the ice in the North Pole. Why is that such a big deal? That's really close to getting or attacking Soviet Union. More Cold War, 1958, Lebanon, Egypt, and the Soviets threatened to take over in the Middle East areas, especially Israel. Nobody liked Israel there. It also was a big oil region, and so that was a way of Soviets getting into some of this oil. And they call on help under the Eisenhower Doctrine, and sure enough, help comes. Ike helps. It's successful, and unfortunately, that pretty much ties our commitment to the Israelis, and it's going to mean that a lot of Middle Eastern people don't really like the United States. In 1960, at Paris summit, more tension springs up as all of a sudden American U-2 spy plane is shot down in Russia. And Khrushchev is kind of like, hey, what's going on here? And Ike, of course, American diplomats are trying to excuse this right away, saying, oh, it blew off course. It shouldn't have been there. It was a mistake. Sun was shining in his eyes and he got off course. Eisenhower just finally said, you know what, we were spying on you. And Russia leaves this Paris peace summit. The Soviet Union decides to help Fidel Castro here. He's going to lead a group of rebels overthrowing an American-supported government in Cuba. America responded by cutting off imports of Cuban sugar. And Castro says, well, if you're going to do that, then we're just going to confiscate all the American property and businesses that are there, and we're going to hook up with the Soviet Union. Well, Ike responds by saying, ooh, we can't let that happen to the rest of Latin America. And so he's going to respond with millions of dollars for Latin American countries, kind of a Marshall Plan for the Western Hemisphere. In 1960, in that election, Eisenhower will not run for a third term because he can't. And you have the Democrat, John F. Kennedy, up against the Republican vice presidential incumbent, Richard Nixon. Kennedy does. Primarily because of his support from workers, Catholics, and blacks. Television would play a huge role as Kennedy and Nixon would debate. Nixon just didn't do well in front of the camera. And interestingly, the Democrats sweep houses. Post-war United States also sees some massive economic changes. In 1948, the computer business grows big time due to the invention of a transistor and silicon. The aerospace industry, thanks to the SAC program, and you're going to see a growing airline business. All of a sudden, we realize we don't have to use planes to transport bombs. We can use planes to transport people from point A to point B. You also, I said, in the 1960s, you would see another women's movement and trying to gain more equality, and so looking to explode more opportunities for consumerism during this time. You see the creation of the credit card, not just credit, but the credit card, that little plastic. Fast food restaurants, service industries grow like crazy. New forms of recreation lead to change in lives of common people. The interstate system meant people could travel more, and so they started to vacation in different parts of the United States. TV was crucial to this lifestyle. In the 1940s, it was something that only the rich had. In the 1960s, you saw every home have at least one TV. It's probably black and white, but they had a TV. One new form of recreation came, and that was in the form of rock and roll, led by Elvis Presley. And not to be outdone, the British will send their little rock and roll quartet over called the Beatles. And all of a sudden, the Beatlemania will begin.